Recently, two murders have occurred in the United States, and everyone knows what they are. Already, only a short time after their occurrence, their consequences have already been understood to be seismic. In fact, when all is said and done, the effects rippling out from these murders will almost certainly extend quite a bit beyond the United States. Many have already given their thoughts on these events, and I would not decide to contribute my voice to that chorus unless I thought I had something to say that was beyond the ordinary fare. And I think I do. So here I am. Now, I'm not going to spend much time going after the raw facts of these cases, since I assume everyone listening to this already knows about them. Just very quickly, Iryna Zarutska was on a train in Charlotte, North Carolina, heading home from work, and while she was sitting there, a black man named Carlos Brown got up behind her, stabbed her multiple times in the neck, nonchalantly walked away, and as she sat there terrified, bleeding to death, everyone around her just sort of watched and did nothing. Eventually she lost consciousness and died on the floor of that train car. In the Kirk case, Charlie Kirk had a speaking engagement at Utah Valley University, and a gunman perched on a building roughly 200 yards from where Kirk was speaking fired a bullet which struck Kirk in the neck, and then Kirk died shortly thereafter. In the Kirk case, more information is still coming out about the alleged assassin, but it seems pretty clear that this was someone with left-wing political beliefs who was politically motivated, who had a transgender lover, and so forth. I mean, we have this information all coming out. I assume everyone knows this. Seems to me the lessons to draw from each of these events are pretty clear. And as I describe them, I will be going over things, admittedly, that some others have said already. But I think that there is something that I can add that hasn't been said anywhere else, or hasn't quite been said. Regarding the Zarutska case first, what is there to say about this? Well, it's quite obvious. This is the reality of racial integration. Not only did this feral animal, frankly, and I'm going to try my best not to Fed post, but this feral, filthy, disgusting freak just up and stabbed an innocent woman to death. And when he walked away, he was caught, or at least it very much seems like he was caught on camera saying something like, "I got that white girl," something like that. So it seems that this murder was clearly racially motivated. In addition to that, Brown had been arrested 14 times previously. And although he did serve a stint in prison of 6 years once, he was, in every other case, pretty much immediately released, often without bail. When one looks at the judges and the magistrates that have been involved with Brown over the course of his criminal history, they're pretty much all black women. In addition to that, after Iryna Zarutska was stabbed and was bleeding to death, terrified, all of the other people in the train car around her, who were all black, by the way, did nothing. They did not lift a finger to help her. What is the lesson to be drawn from this? Very simple. Follow Scott Adams' advice. Just get the hell away from black people. I mean, what else can you say? What else can you learn from this? I can only repeat what Nick Fuentes said. If Iryna Zarutska had been a bit more racist, if she had looked into that train car and said, it's full of black people, shouldn't go in there, she might be alive today. So wherever there are large groups of them, just don't go there. Just don't be there. And if you are there, leave as quickly as possible. If for whatever reason you cannot leave, never, never turn your backs on them. And if anyone gets offended because you look over your shoulder wondering whether someone's behind you, who cares? Who cares? It is not worth it to gamble with your life. This is the reality of multiracial life. This is the reality of the multiracial state. If you are white, these people do not give a shit about you. Even if they don't stab you, even if they don't wantonly murder you, the others will not lift a finger to help you and simply do not care. See, it's bad enough. It's bad enough that for genetic reasons, blacks are predisposed to violent behavior and have difficulty controlling their impulses because of things like the MAOA gene, which is heavily associated with violent behavior. Just to throw some statistics on this, 7% of black men who do not have this gene have been involved in shootings in their lives, which is already a terrifyingly high number. But among those who do have the gene, among the black men who do have the gene, the corresponding figure is 50%. Another statistic, 5.2% of black men are thought to have this MAOA gene, and specifically the R2 variant of it that is so associated with violence and poor impulse control. And the corresponding figure among white men is 0.1%. That's a factor of 52. It's bad, and then of course we can talk about the associations between IQ and the ability to control one's impulses or delay gratification. There's also a relationship there. So these and other genetic factors already make it dangerous enough, already make it unpleasant enough, already entail that you cannot really relax when you're around significant groups of black people. But then, in addition to that, you also have the fact that they have been primed by the media, by the general culture surrounding them, to feel hatred and resentment towards white people. So there's already this predisposition to violence, but it's inflamed further because we have created a civilization that is peaceful, that is prosperous, that is honorable, that is nice to live in, and they have not been able to create anything comparable. They insist that their troubles in life are not due to their own behavior, but due to some phantom oppression that they cannot precisely define. And this resentment, this hatred will not be diffused. So just get the hell away from black people. That's the lesson there. Simple as that. However, there is another angle to this case. Recently, DeCarlos Brown has been released from custody and sent to a mental hospital. He will be there for approximately the next 60 days, during which he is to undergo a mental health evaluation, and the purpose of this evaluation is to determine whether he is competent to stand trial. Now, he has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. If you have listened to a conversation that he had with, I believe it was his sister, shortly after the murder, shortly after he was arrested for it, he can be heard saying that the government implanted some kind of nanomachines into his bloodstream, and that these nanomachines forced him to commit the murder. So he looks crazy. Let's just put it that way. He's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he certainly seems to be acting crazy. Now, I'm going to be very blunt here. I think that the purpose of this evaluation, the purpose of what's happening now that he's been sent to this mental hospital, is to find some sort of excuse, any sort of excuse at all, for why Brown should not be forced to take responsibility for his criminal actions. You see, there's an underlying problem really with the very concept of mental illness itself. And I'm just going to state my thesis here directly and then go on to defend it. Mental illnesses are not real illnesses. They are not literal illnesses. They are metaphorical illnesses. The concept of mental illness is based on a category mistake. And the purpose of the mental health industry, both now and historically, has been to defend and reinforce whatever the dominant social values happen to be in any given society and at any given time. And since now the dominant social values relate around a belief in innate racial equality, a fear about exploring the possibility of genetically based differences between races, and an insistence that that non-whites, most especially blacks and Hispanics, have been unjustly put upon historically, and that the effects of this oppression linger in their communities and are responsible for the, let's say, lackluster performance that they have exhibited. Because these are the prevalent values in society today, because these are the values that are accepted and believed in by the overwhelming majority of so-called mental health professionals, the purpose of the mental health industry as it exists today, apart from selling pills, the kind of the general imperative that exists simply because there are pharmaceutical companies, apart from that, the purpose of the mental health industry today is simply to rationalize bad behavior. A kind of suicidal, pathological, all-consuming empathy has pervaded the culture, and the purpose of psychiatry, the purpose of the mental health industry, is to reinforce that. So the mental health industry exists to excuse bad behavior. Now I'm going to go on to defend what I've just said. First, we need to be clear about a few things. The first and most important thing to do is to set down precisely what is meant by illness or disease. What is an illness? What is disease? What is this concept? Well, simply it is this. A disease is any sort of physiological abnormality. That could be a lesion, it could be some sort of structural problem, some sort of procedural deficiency in the body, anything like that. Anything that is abnormal, that diverges from the established pattern of bodily and physiological functioning or behavior, and that is evaluated or believed or thought or considered to be negative. So you need both of these things. The reason why? Well, extremely intelligent people with genius IQs, are physiologically abnormal. The glucose metabolic rates of their brains are exceptionally high. The speed of neuronal transmission along their nervous system is higher than average. So extremely intelligent people are in that sense physiologically abnormal, but we don't say that they're ill because we evaluate that abnormality positively. The same goes for people who are 7 feet tall or who are left-handed. We have generally neutral attitudes towards these physiological abnormalities, and so we regard them as we don't regard them as illnesses, rather. So a disease is any sort of physiological abnormality which is evaluated negatively. This can manifest in behavior. It can create behavioral symptoms. It can manifest in all sorts of ways. But the root of it is this physiological abnormality, a physiological abnormality which, in principle at least, is detectable by some sort of test or some sort of examination. In other words, the process of diagnosis, once we have a bona fide, fully established, confirmed disease, a confirmed instance of a disease, the process of diagnosis is purely technical. That is to say, if a pathologist had the full suite of physiological information concerning a patient, and if he knew everything there was to know about physiology, then in principle, and of course was allowed to run whichever tests it pleased him to run on the physiological samples, the tissue samples, whatever it is that he has, if he had all of this information in front of him, knew everything there was to know about the body, and could run whichever tests on whichever samples it pleased him to run, then in principle, a pathologist should be able to diagnose every genuine instance of disease without meeting the patient. The behavior of the patient, although some diseases can have behavioral manifestations, would be irrelevant to the process of diagnosis. Diagnosis is a purely technical operation. However, when one looks at psychiatry, when one examines the clinical and diagnostic practices of psychiatry, one sees that this principle that I've just enunciated is not adhered to. Looking through really any edition of the DSM that one pleases to look through, one sees all sorts of alleged mental illnesses listed and all sorts of diagnostic criteria associated with those mental illnesses, and yet, overwhelmingly, almost entirely really, things come down to behavioral symptoms. If the patient displays certain behaviors, then he may be diagnosed with a given mental illness, schizophrenia, depression, ADHD, whatever. There's no discussion of pathophysiology. And yet, in genuine organic diseases, there is always some pathophysiology. If you wish to diagnose someone with diabetes, you don't have to meet the patient in order to make a successful diagnosis. You simply need, for example, a blood sample after the patient has fasted for a certain number of hours, and then you run tests on the blood, you examine the blood sample, you run tests on it, and if the glucose level in that blood sample is above a certain level, then the patient has diabetes. If it is not above that level, the patient does not have diabetes. It's a totally technical operation. Similarly, with epilepsy, there are certain lesions that are associated with epilepsy. Certain reactions are typically typically observed, I should say, in the nervous systems of epileptics. It is a purely technical process to determine whether these physiological reactions, whether these physiological events take place or not. Parkinson's has a pathophysiology, and so on and so forth. Now, what is the pathophysiology of schizophrenia? What is the pathophysiology of depression? What is the pathophysiology of ADHD? Again, to anyone who doubts me, please give me a list of precisely what physiological criteria distinguish, for example, a schizophrenic from a non-schizophrenic. Do not talk to me about behavior, okay? Because in any case of genuine organic disease, I may walk into a doctor's office and I may display the behavioral symptoms typically associated with that disease. However, if the physician runs the requisite tests, he will be able to see through my act. I can walk into a doctor's office and pretend to have Parkinson's and start trembling, but if the appropriate tests are run, the physician will know that I'm faking. The physician will know that I'm lying. So if the criteria for diagnosing, for example, schizophrenia are behavioral symptoms, strange, beliefs, unusual thought patterns, just a general kind of appearance of someone being crazy, having weird beliefs like the belief that the government implanted nanomachines into your bloodstream. If these are the only diagnostic criteria, then presumably, if someone is a good enough actor, he can fool the physician and be diagnosed with a mental illness when he doesn't, quote unquote, really have one. This is not possible in the case of organic disease. There's an objective test that can see through these things. So there's a problem here. And then, of course, if you add the additional factor that psychiatrists have a professional interest in diagnosing patients with mental illnesses because it legitimizes their profession. It establishes the idea that they are doing something important. And then, of course, you have further factors, the possible political beliefs of the psychiatrist, the sympathy or lack thereof for a criminal or some other person in some sort of distress that supposedly has a mental illness. These can all influence the manner in which the psychiatrist interprets the behavioral signs that he sees the patient displaying, and therefore they can influence his diagnosis. So there are no objective factors here. There's no objective test. There's no blood test. There's no brain scan. There's no EEG. There's no examination of the cerebral spinal fluid. Nothing like that, as would be in the case of of neurological diseases, of brain tumors, of Parkinson's, of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or any other organic disease. There is that problem. So anyone doubting me when I say that mental illness is a metaphor, that it is ultimately based on a category mistake, that it treats something which may be like an organic condition in certain respects, but is different in certain other crucial respects. Anyone who doubts me on this, please just give me the precise pathophysiology of, for example, schizophrenia, and how, purely by a physiological examination, one can distinguish schizophrenics from non-schizophrenics. Now, if your reply to this challenge is to say, well, we don't understand the matter quite well enough, we're still investigating, there's still things we don't know, all right, fair enough. But in that case, you cannot say that schizophrenia, for example, is a disease. At best, it is a putative disease. At best, it is something that might be a disease. At best, it is something which future investigation may reveal to have a precise pathophysiology. But at this point, it is not known to be such. So that's generally the situation. I mean, even if, let's say in the future, it were discovered that there's some precise pathophysiology for schizophrenia and some treatment that attacks this ultimate organic cause were discovered, well, then those diagnosed with schizophrenia would no longer go to psychiatrists for treatment. They would go to neurologists. It was once believed that, for example, epilepsy was a form of mental illness, or neurosis as it was earlier called. When physicians like Freud would meet with people who would display bizarre hysterical symptoms, as they were then referred to, some of which might be sudden seizures, convulsions of the body, strange contortions, things like that. He saw those things quite often in his clinical practice. His inclination was to diagnose these people as mentally ill in some sense, although some proportion of Freud's patients, it's not clear what proportion, but at least some proportion, had some sort of improperly diagnosed organic illness like epilepsy. But now that it's known what the pathophysiology of epilepsy is, and that those who display the kind of behavioral symptoms like bodily contortions and seizures, that those people aren't mentally ill, they have an organic illness, epilepsy. And when they go to get treated for epilepsy, they don't go to a psychiatrist, they go to a neurologist who gives them anti-seizure medication, and so on. By the way, as an interesting aside, Freud's famous patient Anna O, and also as a further aside, Henri Ellenberger, the historian of psychiatry, he was able through some detective work to determine that Anna O was probably a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. But and Freud, who claimed to have cured her of her neurosis, actually didn't. Ellenberger was able to essentially, track what she did in her life after she had been Freud's patient, and the same symptoms that she had been experiencing while his patient continued recurring. In any event, just as an aside, Elizabeth Thornton has an interesting book in which she argues, among other things, that Anna O probably had tuberculosis meningitis, and that the reason for her bizarre, quote-unquote, hysterical symptoms was that the tuberculosis bacillus had gotten into her brain and had infected her brain. She makes a pretty compelling argument for that. But the reason I bring this up is that I don't reject out of hand the possibility that those whom we call mentally ill may sometimes have some undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or hitherto unknown organic illness. It's possible. However, we can only say then that they are at best putatively ill, that they possibly may have some unknown organic disease. we cannot call them mentally ill because again, mental illness is based on a category mistake. Only an organ or organ system can be ill, and the mind is not an organ. Therefore, mental illness is a metaphor. If some organic cause were to be discovered for schizophrenia, then schizophrenic patients would go to neurologists and not to psychiatrists. So, yeah, that's the first thing I want to point out. That these are metaphorical diseases. They are, and to be clear, what I mean when I say that they are metaphorical diseases, let me first just pause for a moment to explain what I mean by a metaphor. What is a metaphor? Very simply, one makes a metaphor when one refers to something as if it were something else. If you say, he was a raging bull about, some man, you don't mean that he was literally a raging bull. You mean, for example, that he was angry and aggressive, like a raging bull might be. That is, you point to a similarity between two things, in this case a man and a raging bull, and those two things are not totally the same, they are different from one another, but because they share some similarity, you describe them or you refer to them as if they were the same. That's what a metaphor is. And that's what's going on with the concept of mental illness. The behaviors that we associate with mental illness, the things that we call mental diseases, they are like organic diseases in certain ways, i.e. they make people's lives uncomfortable, they're unpleasant, we have negative associations with them, we don't like them, and so on. But they're also different from organic diseases in that they don't have known or clear organic causes. And so we speak of the two under a metaphorical aspect as if they were one thing. The second part of my thesis here about psychiatry is that its purpose historically has been to defend whichever social values happen to be dominant in any society at any given time. And this is abundantly clear if one simply studies the history of psychiatry. One of my favorite examples to show this is to point out that in the United States, before slavery had been abolished, there was claimed to be a mental illness called drapetomania. And who suffered from drapetomania? Well, runaway slaves. In other words, in a society in which slavery was perfectly acceptable, it was considered crazy that anyone might so object to being a slave as to actually attempt to escape his condition and run away from his slave master. So if you ran away from your slave master, you were labeled mentally ill. This is not a real diagnosis of disease. This is simply stigmatization meant to enforce some prevailing social value, in that case, slavery. Also, in earlier editions of the DSM, homosexuality was considered a mental illness. The attitudes of society changed. All of a sudden it no longer is. It's no longer listed in the later editions. Now that was not due to any sort of scientific discovery. That was due to a change in social values. I mean, I can give further examples. In the Soviet Union, after the Stalinist period, when they stopped sending people to gulags and decided that they were going to punish anti-communist dissidents more gently, the go-to solution for dealing with political dissidents was to send them to mental hospitals. So in other words, if you publicly and openly disagreed with communist ideology, well, you must be crazy. You must be mentally ill. Earlier, in earlier societies that were more patriarchal, in which it was more clearly and strongly accepted that men should dominate the household and control their wives, if a woman was too argumentative with her husband or annoyed him too much, he could have her committed to a mental hospital as hysterical, as insane. And one can imagine a society, for example, that is run by feminists And those feminists can decide that any man who spends too much time staring at a woman or giving her unwanted sexual attention can be labeled as mentally ill and also sent off to a mental hospital. In other words, this is not a function of scientific investigation or diagnosis. It is a function of whatever the prevailing values happen to be. And this is the case now with our society. The prevailing attitudes among those in the mental health profession, and more generally in what you might call the clerisy, the sort of educated class, the kind of managerial elite that's in all the influential positions, most of the brain workers, teachers, journalists, physicians, criminal justice attorneys, etc., etc. You know who I'm referring to, the people that Mencius Moldbug called the Brahmins. The prevailing attitudes among them is that criminals are not responsible, really, morally, for their crimes, and that the explanation for criminal behavior lies in some sort of social deficiency, some sort of social flaw, that these people did not receive the proper social amenities when they were growing up, and therefore they were moved to criminal behavior. If one believes this, then one will be inclined to look for any excuse that one can find to excuse criminal behavior and to acquit alleged criminals and allow them to escape responsibility for their crimes. Hence the insanity defense. So that's what I predict is going to happen in the case of DeCarlos Brown. Rather, I should be clear. Brown is facing federal charges, and with the federal government currently being what it is, I don't expect there to be much patience shown toward the idea of an insanity defense, especially given the high-profile nature of the crime he committed. However, this will be attempted, and even though it will probably fail, there are going to be people who will believe it. But the root of the problem here is the psychiatric industry more generally, the mental health industry more generally, which today, to repeat what I've said, exists solely for the dual purpose of selling pills and rationalizing bad behavior. That's what it does. Anyone who disagrees with me, please provide me a comprehensive list of all of the pathophysiological criteria for whatever your favorite mental illness is. And do not say, well, we don't understand that now, we're investigating it now. Perhaps so. But in that case, you don't have a full-fledged, genuine case of disease, you have a putative disease. So that's really all this is. We're dealing with a kind of system of rhetoric, of rhetorical devices, that drapes itself in the authority of science and uses that authority to fool people into allowing criminals and other genuinely annoying or immoral people to escape responsibility for the things they do. So I will say this. There are good people and there are evil people. There are criminals and there are non-criminals. There are those who conform to the standards of society and those who do not. But there are no mentally ill people. That is a category mistake. So I'll say this. When dealing with a case like that of DeCarlos Brown or of Tyler Robinson, the alleged assassin of Charlie Kirk, do not call these people mentally ill. Do not say that. Because by doing this, even if you do not intend to do so, you are providing an excuse that can be used, possibly, to allow these people to escape responsibility for their actions. I mean, just think carefully about the notion of what mental illness is or is understood to be, and of the idea of the insanity defense. Now, there are two propositions here that are of importance. First is the idea that anyone who has a mental illness is, to the extent that he is mentally ill, robbed of free will, robbed of the ability to control his actions, and therefore is not responsible for his actions. That's the first proposition. And the second proposition, and this is quite commonly believed, is that anyone who commits criminal acts anyone who is a criminal is ipso facto mentally ill. It's common to refer to any criminal as mentally ill, especially rather infamous criminals who commit particularly shocking crimes. But some careful thought about this reveals something pretty striking. If you believe these two propositions, if you believe the conjunction of these two things, that mental illness deprives one of free will and hence of responsibility for one's actions, and that anyone who commits a crime is mentally ill, then the logical conclusion to draw from the conjunction of these two propositions is that the entire criminal justice system should be abolished. But no one draws that conclusion. We instead exist in this kind of bizarre limbo state. And the presence of psychiatrists, the ability to mount the insanity defense, is simply a tactic to secure acquittal for criminals. In practice, that's all it does. Now, if you want to say, well, mental illness is real, but it doesn't necessarily remove responsibility for criminal behavior, well then why bother calling psychiatrists to testify at criminal trials? If mental illness has no effect on whether one is able to control oneself or is responsible for what one does, then the testimony of psychiatrists with respect to whether an accused, a defendant in a criminal trial, is mentally ill or not, is irrelevant to the outcome of the trial. It simply doesn't matter. What would be the purpose of calling them in? So again, there's this kind of limbo state that exists here with respect to psychiatrists in the justice system. We don't want to be fully honest about what's going on, and that allows a window, that allows for them to sort of get a wedge in and try to manipulate things and, as I say, rationalize bad behavior. Further example of the political and social nature of what is taken to be mental illness. Here's another example. The right thinks that transgenderism is mental illness. The left thinks that racism is mental illness. So to say X is mentally ill is really just another way of saying I vehemently disagree with something that X said or did. That's all it functionally means. And if some organic pathophysiology is found for some condition that is claimed to be a mental illness, that once that is found, that condition immediately ceases to be a mental illness and becomes an organic illness. Mental illness itself is a kind of limbo category. It's a category of things and behaviors and processes that we don't understand, but that we want to pretend we understand. And there's a whole rhetoric surrounding it. Anyway, that's sort of all I want to say about the Brown case. Let's move on to the Charlie Kirk case now. Okay. It is abundantly clear, because plenty of evidence has already come out, and more is continuing to come out now, that Tyler Robinson, the alleged assassin of Charlie Kirk, had a transgender lover and was politically motivated. His family said that he had recently gone down a deep rabbit hole of left-wing politics. They found text messages, Discord chats, a letter that he wrote, just abundant evidence indicating that this person had left-wing political views. Despite that, two competing narratives have emerged on the internet, and they have been pounced on by two different groups of, I'm just going to call them unreasonable people so that I don't get too heated. Two different groups of unreasonable people. And the two narratives are as follows. One, that Tyler Robinson was a groyper, and the other, that he was a patsy for Israel. Now, let me go through these two and shoot them down pretty quickly. The Tyler Robinson was a groyper narrative is one that one typically sees on the left. Of course, there's the usual sort of lying nonsense coming out from the left now, claiming that Tyler Robinson was conservative because his parents were conservative, because, as we know, all children always agree with their parents on everything, and no divergences of opinion ever happen. There's that, and then there's the groyper narrative specifically. Now, prima facie to most people, including most people on the right who don't know what groypers are, who've never heard of Nick Fuentes. This just sounds bizarre. Why would a far-right group, a member of a far-right group, have a transgender lover? What on earth are they talking about? Let me explain all of this. The groypers, obviously, I don't think anyone in my audience doesn't know this, but the groypers are followers of Nick Fuentes. And there is actually some reason behind the allegation that they are connected with transgenderism. Okay, because Nick Fuentes has been found in transgender Telegram groups. He's done some weird things, let's put it this way. I'm not going to go into detail on all the lore because the lore is enormous and this video would be hideously long if I did. But anyone who is curious about the sorts of things that Nick Fuentes gets up to, the sorts of things that would be embarrassing for the right, I would look into some of what the Kino Casino has talked about with respect to Fuentes, because they've revealed a lot of this. Yes, it's true he's been in transgender Telegram groups. Nick Fuentes is almost certainly gay. There's plenty of behavior from him that very strongly will suggest that to any reasonable person who looks at it objectively. So there is this kind of weird degeneracy surrounding the groypers. So what's going on? What's the explanation for that? Well, quite simply, Nick Fuentes is a Fed. Okay? On January 6th, 2021, Nick Fuentes was present near the Capitol building, and he was caught on video saying, and I quote, "break down the barriers and disregard the police." That is, encouraging the rioters. Nick Fuentes was never arrested for this. Nick Fuentes was never charged with a crime for this. At the same time, people who did far less than he did in inciting people or in anything like, people who did far less, people who were not even physically present at the Capitol on that day, were arrested and charged with offenses in relation to those events. Now, I'm not saying that these other people should not, deserve to be charged, or that Nick Fuentes himself should have been charged. It's very clear that the entire situation on January 6th was some kind of FBI-instigated honeypot operation. So I'm not saying that. However, the agenda of the government was clear at that time. They were looking for any excuse that they could find to nab as many people that were Trump supporters and charge them with whatever they could think of charging them with. And yet somehow, in this environment, Nick Fuentes was able to avoid criminal charges. How? I mean, wouldn't the left celebrate it if they got someone like Nick Fuentes into jail? How did that not happen? I think it is completely reasonable to speculate that the FBI, shortly after January 6th, paid Fuentes a visit and threatened him with jail time unless he cooperated. And I think it's reasonable to speculate that he chickened out and he made some sort of deal with the FBI. And there are things that suggest that. First, to my knowledge, he has never raised any money for any January 6th defendant or done anything to help them. Secondly, the tone of his show after January 6, 2021 takes a noticeable shift. Suddenly you start seeing all these bizarre pro-pedophilia, pro-grooming comments. He starts referring to himself as an incel. He starts making ridiculous statements like, and I quote, "having sex with women is gay." People have speculated, and I think quite reasonably, that Fuentes was told by his FBI handlers to say these things in order to discredit the right. And as he was saying these things, and as he was doing the sorts of things he was doing, his handlers at the FBI were accumulating the information that resulted from this, and now they are using that information to perpetrate a psyop on the left. This is why the left is saying that Tyler Robinson was a groyper. This is where this comes from. It's all bullshit. It's all made up. This is the explanation for it. Okay. The second thing. the the Charlie Kirk was killed by Israel story. Now, look, I just simply don't believe this. Um, I obviously am not a fan of Israel or of Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't support them, but I just don't see the evidence here. I've read the Max Blumenthal article speculating about this, and if you read it carefully, you will realize that its only source is anonymous. That the central claim in the article that Kirk, shortly before his death, was offered a massive check for about $150 million from Netanyahu and then refused the money. That comes from an anonymous source. Now, we live in a world today where there are grifters and schizos and liars and nonsense merchants on all imaginable sides of the political spectrum. And to prevent oneself from falling for any of the nonsense that such people peddle, one needs to have some epistemological standards for how one processes and parses information. And one of those standards should be this. If the only source in your article is an anonymous one, then you assume that the entire article is bullshit no matter what it says. Okay? And these claims are being repeated by Harrison Smith of InfoWars, who claimed that Charlie Kirk was, afraid of the Israeli government and afraid of Zionist organizations and of crossing them. Candace Owens is saying the same thing. Look, I'm not averse to blaming Israel for this. Israel has done some pretty blood-curdling things in its history, but if I'm going to say that they killed Charlie Kirk, I'm going to need a little bit more than having Candace Owens, Harrison Smith, and Max Blumenthal essentially just say, trust me, bro. That's not good enough. It's just not good enough for me. And then furthermore, you have the issue where, I'm just going to be frank about this. Like, I think the Gray Zone, the outlet that Blumenthal wrote that article for, I think that whole thing is basically just a Russian op at this point. Now, if one looks through some comments that Charlie Kirk made here and there, one can find a few things in which he is critical of Israel. One can find a few comments like this. I remember one video where he blames Jewish billionaires for funding open borders initiatives and for helping get migrants into various countries. He had an interview with Ben Shapiro. I think this was the last one he ever did, where he just sort of questioned, well, is the media narrative that we're being told about Israel, is it correct? There's another clip I saw where he gets angry because some Zionist affiliated groups or organizations or donors got angry with him because he invited Dave Smith on his show and hosted a debate with him about Israel, and he was angry that these people were questioning his character merely for platforming Smith and so on. Now, I can believe all of that. I can, because we all know how paranoid Zionists are about anti-Semitism. They're on a hair trigger about it. If you're not 100% pro-Israel all the way and you ask even the mildest of questions, you're an anti-Semite. They're completely unreasonable in this respect. So I can believe that. And I can believe that there might have been some frustration on the part of Charlie Kirk with some of these people. But I don't buy that he was changing his mind on Israel or had changed his mind on Israel. Now, if he had lived longer, who knows? The fact of the matter is, not only has Israel at this point completely lost the left in America, which hates Israel, but they are well and truly in the process of losing the right as well. Although Israel still controls the current generation of the Republican Party, it's clear that young conservatives, young rightists do not like Israel either. And when they get older and they ascend into positions of power, Israel is not going to be able to control them. Charlie Kirk, of course, ran the premier conservative youth organization in America. And so I'm sure that he encountered many young right-wingers who were critical of Israel. He encountered these arguments. He saw them. He heard them. He had to grapple with them. I'm sure of that. I'm sure that happened. I am not convinced, however, that he did a 180 on Israel at some point and Israel killed him. I mean, I don't see the evidence for it. You have to remember, not only was Charlie Kirk pro-Israel for political reasons, but he was, more importantly, he was pro-Israel for religious reasons. He was a Christian Zionist. I'd actually seen a clip, a rather bizarre clip, I have to say, of Charlie Kirk and his wife talking about how the two of them keep the Sabbath in the Jewish way, that is, on Saturdays. Just very odd. So he clearly saw that there was something special or integral about Judaism and about the land of Israel to his Christian faith as he understood it. So for him to turn against Israel, he would really have had to have changed his entire theology. And how likely is that? I mean, I just don't see it. Maybe there were some mild questions, some mild objections here and there, but I don't think there was anything like a major turnaround. I think that this whole event, this whole assassination, is what it looks like. Some crazy, schizo, pro-transgender leftist snapped, thought Charlie Kirk was a Nazi, and went out and shot him. And what does this mean for us? Well, it's obvious. Charlie Kirk, whether he wanted to become this, rather whether he would be happy to be this or not, has basically become a white Christian martyr. That's what he is. And what makes him such a potent symbol is precisely the fact that he had what, objectively speaking, were boring, milquetoast, pretty middle of the road, center-right kind of views. That was Charlie Kirk's entire political program. It was center-right Republican Party talking points and Christian Zionism. That's what he was about, which is why, admittedly, I never followed Charlie Kirk while he was alive. I just never found him interesting. I didn't care about him. He never said anything that impressed me or interested me in the slightest way. And I'll admit openly now, I never really cared about him until he died, because now he's become a symbol. It's like that Star Wars thing with Obi-Wan Kenobi. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you could ever imagine. And that's what's happened now. Everyone is now making Charlie Kirk out to be more than he was. The left has always done this, calling him a Nazi when he had objectively mild, milquetoast, center-right views, just lying about him. But the right is doing it now as well. Some of them are saying that he went against Israel, even though there's really no evidence of this. There are a few people hinting that he was gradually becoming more and more based on the race question. And I don't know if he was so much as that the young conservatives around him were, and he was just sort of running into these ideas by osmosis. Because you have to understand, you have to remember what Charlie Kirk and his organization Turning Point USA really were. It's well known outside of the echo chamber of schizo-leftists who think that everyone who disagrees with them even slightly is a Nazi. It's well known outside of that particular echo chamber that the far right, the real far right, did not and never did like Charlie Kirk. Many of us, I'm sure, can remember the Groyper War from back in 2019, when Nick Fuentes sent a few of his followers to question Charlie Kirk during one of his speaking events. And of course, Charlie Kirk was deeply embarrassed about this. His initial response was to harshly fight back against criticism from the right, about Israel, about the liberty, about support for homosexuality in the conservative movement and so forth. We have that famous question: how does anal sex help us win the culture war? His initial response was to go hard against that, and it didn't work. He was embarrassed. This was the moment when Nick Fuentes peaked. As far as I'm concerned, it's been all downhill for him ever since. But Charlie Kirk, this has to be said to his credit, he was an extremely talented political organizer and tactician, because he learned the proper lesson from the Groyper War. He learned that these harder, more radical elements on the right are going to be there and that he's not going to be able to stamp them out. And so the best thing he can do is invite them to his group, bring them under his umbrella, and attempt to soften and diffuse them. Give them time to express their ideas, but ultimately, don't allow them a kind of dominant position. This is why he has become all things to all people, because he was willing to tolerate right-wing criticism of Israel, because he was willing to tolerate views that were more honest and direct about the real reasons for the disparities among the races in crime and violence and these sorts of things. He was willing to tolerate views that were openly pro-white and that just talked about race in an honest and realistic way, that knew what it meant to live around large numbers of non-whites and what that would do to our societies and so forth. He was willing to tolerate those views, even if he never expressed them himself. He was willing to allow people into his organization that said those things, and in so doing to diffuse them. And because he did that, he became all things to all people. And this is why you now have people who believe that he was becoming anti-Zionist, even who say that, he went to Trump and he asked him not to bomb Iran, but Trump did it anyway. And of course, what did Charlie Kirk do after the bombing? Well, he ultimately spoke out in favor of it, that, it was just a little bit of a bombing, it's no big deal. So I don't believe any of this. I think the story is what it looks like, that you have this left-wing, pro-transgender, schizo freak who did this. Now, what does this mean? First and foremost, it means that being center-right is pointless. The left is insane. They cannot tolerate the slightest bit of dissent. And they are going to call you far-right no matter what, even if your views are objectively mild. If someone with the kind of boring, milquetoast views that Charlie Kirk had could be lied about, called a Nazi, and targeted for assassination, then that means that it's basically open season on any even slightly prominent person who has even slightly right-of-center views. These maniacs are going to try to kill you. You have to be ready for that. It's like that Sam Hyde video that came out recently where he showed pictures of Charlie Kirk in the beginning and said, "This is you." There's a reason why that's so powerful. It's because it's true. It's because it worked. It got to the heart of the issue. This is you. Charlie Kirk's boring views mean that the crosshairs are on you, whether you like it or not. You will not be able to escape being lied about. The left very clearly views itself as being at war with the right. You see, for all the people lamenting the Charlie Kirk assassination and trying desperately to get everyone to turn down the temperature, first of all, no one really believes that things are going to calm down and that there's going to be some kind of national reconciliation after this. Of course, I want to be absolutely clear. Do not do anything violent. No, do not get yourself into any trouble. Do not do anything like that. However, realistically, people aren't going to calm down. Human nature being what it is, they aren't going to, regardless of what I or anyone else has to say about it. So things are probably going to get worse. And for all the people lamenting political violence, you see, I had said earlier that when I spoke on the subject of mental illness and psychiatry, that we have to be clear about our definitions. And once again, I will repeat that. We have to be clear about our definitions. There is a term that we have to describe a state of affairs in which people gather together in large numbers and begin to kill one another over political differences. That term is war. Okay? The left has decided that there are certain political opinions that are so beyond the pale that nothing is too much as punishment or or as a way of retribution or attack or resistance against these people, evidently including assassination. So it doesn't matter what your views are. If you are even slightly to the right, they will lie about you, they will smear you, they will kill you, they will dance on your grave, they will celebrate your death, and then they will say either that you deserved it or that it was another right-winger who killed you. They are at war, and they truly believe this to their core. And when you are at war, any lie, any trick, any underhanded tactic is acceptable if it allows you to vanquish the enemy. That's how they think. That's where we are. You see, for the people lamenting the collapse of our institutions, because there has now been a right-wing backlash to this, there has been a kind of right-wing cancel culture emerging. Plenty of leftists who were found to be celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination have been fired from their jobs. These include teachers, doctors, even a Secret Service agent in one case, members of the military, and so forth. Just yesterday, the day before I'm sitting down to record this, Jimmy Kimmel lost his show. So there is a right-wing cancel culture now. It's interesting to see that the right finally has enough cultural pull to actually be able to use the same tactics on the left that the left started using 10 years ago. And of course, they're freaking out. They're all of a sudden pretending to care about free speech. We know their reaction. Don't believe this. None of their scruples are sincere. They just don't want to lose. Okay? Do not allow leftists to hold you to a principle which they themselves do not respect and whose protections they would never extend to you if they were in a position of power over you. And in fact, this is not a hypothetical. When I say that leftists would never extend the protections of free speech to you, we already know that because they've been in a position to choose to either extend or not extend those protections, and they've chosen not to extend them. We know what they are. We know who they are. We know how they behave. And look, I will acknowledge that there are dangers to the nascent right-wing cancel culture that's emerging, if you want to call it that. I certainly do not want to live in this ridiculous tattletale society in which everyone fires one another and damages people's livelihoods over their political opinions. But it doesn't matter what I think. The genie is out of the bottle, and the left does not have scruples. If the right allows its scruples to paralyze it, it will be destroyed. You have to fight fire with fire. This is simply a matter of survival at this point. You are at war. De facto, you are at war, whether you choose to admit it or not. This is how it is. They do not see you as worthy of having moral consideration extended to you, and so if you do not reciprocate that treatment, you will be destroyed. That's where we are. I'm sorry to say that. Those complaining about the decay of American institutions, look, American institutions are dead. American institutions, they're dead. They've been dead for a long time. They're gone. It's been over for a while. Look, in every society, there are agreements that there's a kind of tacit agreement that people come to about how things are done within that society. These are not necessarily principles that are codified into law. Almost in all cases, they are not codified into law. These are principles that just reflect the prevailing social mores, the prevailing situation. They reflect how things are done in that particular society. And in the United States, up until pretty recently, the way things were done was this. You don't harass, intimidate, persecute, or attempt to arrest people for political disagreements. The left viewed itself as being morally justified to violate that principle. If they are willing to violate that principle and you are not willing to violate it, you will be destroyed. Yes, it is a shame. It is a lamentable thing that the civilized, kind of liberal in the good sense, liberal in the original sense, institutions of the United States are dead. And it would be better to live in a society in which these institutions were strong. It would be better to live in a society in which everyone respected the principle of free speech, but we don't live in that society. As I said, these people will tell any lie to avoid responsibility for what they have done and are still doing to this day, to this moment. They will continue to push lies like the lie that political violence is coming from both sides. No, we have data on this. Okay, there's clear data about which side supports free speech and which side does not. Which side believes that it is justifiable to silence someone and harass them and persecute them and possibly even kill them for political differences, and which side is not. And the side that believes in those things today is overwhelmingly the left, especially the left-wing youth. Okay? And as far as organizations like the ADL and the Persecution Project that try to tally up political violence and present the image that most political violence in the United States is of right-wing origin. Well, if one simply looks at how the data there were constructed, one sees that the whole thing is a political influence scheme masquerading as a scientific organization. It's a joke. The George Floyd riots, the BLM riots, were not included in the tally of left-wing political violence. So the way that these people think about political violence is that if they agree with the beliefs of the perpetrators of political violence, then the political violence doesn't count as political violence. And then they also, in an effort to inflate the right-wing numbers, they will add things, acts that, violent acts that were not politically motivated and that are acknowledged not to be politically motivated, even though they were committed by people with right-wing views. So they're ignoring cases of left-wing violence and not counting them, and then counting cases of right-wing political violence that are not politically motivated in order to present a misleading picture. They're lying to you again. This is political manipulation. If you simply included the George Floyd riots, the BLM riots, with the hundreds of cases of looting, of arson, of theft, of assault, of battery, of property destruction, that alone would be enough to make it abundantly clear that the overwhelming bulk of political violence in America today comes from the left. But the left's self-conception is that we are the good guys by definition, and we are fighting the bad guys by definition. And so anything we do, no matter what it is by definition good. These are people who are psychologically incapable of taking any accountability for what they did, which means that an escalation of the conflict that is brewing now is unfortunately inevitable. These people will not reflect on what they've done. They will not take stock of anything. They will not take responsibility for anything. Okay? These recent actions where leftists have been fired because they were found celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination, they will not interpret this as just punishment for a crazed instance of political persecution that they started 10 years ago. They will not see this as just retribution, as just punishment for them, as something they deserve. No, they will see this as escalation by the right, and they will paint this to say that the right is crazy, that the right cannot be negotiated with, and that we have no choice but to fight them. That's what they will do. And since that is inevitable, since they are psychologically incapable of taking responsibility for anything, then I regret to inform you all, although I'm sure anyone listening to this already knows it, that things are only going to get worse. I'm sorry to say that. I don't know that things will erupt into a full-blown civil war. I must say, even now, that appears unlikely to me, just because as a society we seem to be too decadent now. But we may very well see something in the coming years or decades that resembles the years of lead in Italy, where communist and fascist groups, the fascist groups being funded by the CIA and the communist groups being funded by the Kremlin, each took turns assassinating one another's members. We may unfortunately see something like that. But, as everyone has already remarked, the irony of the name of Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, could not be more palpable. You see, the root of our problem in America today, the thing that everything comes down to, is that, as I've said before, America is not a nation. Certainly not anymore. It is a fake country. It is not a nation. It is a collection of people who hate each other, who have been forced to live together in the same geographical area. The most peaceful solution to this would be some form of national divorce, where we peaceably split up the country, and we say, okay, left goes here, right goes there. We have two different countries. We don't bother each other. That might create peace, but I don't think anyone will agree to it, unfortunately. The left won't agree to it because they can't tolerate dissent. They can't tolerate the existence of anyone who doesn't think like they do. And the right, specifically the boomer conservatives, will not accept that either, because they are attached to the idea of one single united America. So yeah, we are in for interesting times. Let's put it that way. These ghouls on the left will dance over your grave. They will smile when you are murdered. They will laugh when your sister is raped. They will laugh, they will celebrate gleefully when your family is shot to pieces. This is who they are. They don't care. They have decided that they are at war with you, and that any tactic in their campaign to exterminate you, however underhanded that tactic may be, is acceptable. And you have to react accordingly. You have to prepare yourself. You have to understand what that means. Okay? So, do not get yourselves into trouble. Do not do anything illegal. Do not start anything. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. But be ready. Be prepared. If you don't own a gun, buy one. If you don't know how to use one, learn. Protect yourself, protect your family, and be ready for anything that might happen. Don't start anything. Do not under any circumstances start anything. But be ready just in case, because you know they will come at you. They have their messianic psychotic delusions. They think that everything they do is justified. And there can't be peaceful coexistence with these people. We just fundamentally live in a country with people who are not really organically our countrymen. We are a fake nation. That's the root of it. And the consequences of that idea will, over the coming years and decades, gradually work themselves out. What the consequence of that will be ultimately, I cannot predict. Whether that will end in some sort of mutual secessionist movement where the country splits into a left wing and a right wing half, or perhaps along some sort of different dividing line, or whether the country stays together as one and just gradually degrades and debases itself as a result of, yes, racial mongrelization, but also, and this has to be said, of the increasingly ham-fisted, dumb, stupid, third world-like economic policies that the right is increasingly finding congenial, so that the country gradually slips into poverty, gradually becomes more corrupt, more violent. Its atmosphere will become more acrimonious and will essentially turn into some kind of dysfunctional hellhole like Brazil that, yeah, it exists, but it doesn't really do anything. It's of no significance geopolitically or globally. I don't know which of those things will happen. And by the way, this is why, it's because I've acknowledged, I've admitted to myself that America is a sinking ship, that America as a whole at least, perhaps it may be different for some portion of America, but America as a whole at least cannot be saved, cannot be salvaged. because I have acknowledged this. That is one of the reasons why I care as much as I do about the war in Ukraine. And by the way, I'm sure everyone is wondering what I have to say about Trump's actions. I will make a future video shortly where I address those. I'll just say briefly here that Trump very obviously doesn't have a plan, very clearly doesn't have a clue what he's doing, and he is making world historic errors that will lead to, yes, the collapse of the American empire, but that was inevitable anyway. It will lead to a collapse of the American empire that will happen sooner than it needed to happen, will happen sooner than it otherwise might have happened. Let's put it that way. I do think he's ultimately making a world historic error. And because America's time as the nicest place to live in the world is really numbered, it's not going to last more than, who knows, perhaps 30 years or so, we must begin casting about and searching for other places in the world which can be hospitable to a new civilization. And I think that despite its obvious problems, despite the clear difficulties that it has to face, and despite it not being evident at all whether Ukraine will at this stage ultimately overcome those many difficulties or not, nevertheless, Ukraine is, or a country like Poland even, that whole sort of general Eastern European but non-Russian area, is prime territory for the emergence of a new civilization. The reason why I say that, very briefly, I'll just make this quick comment and then probably end the video because I don't want to turn it into a discussion on this subject. I'm just mentioning it because I know I will receive questions about it, and I upload rarely, so I have to address this. Very briefly, if one studies the history of the rise, fall, and collapse of civilizations, one notices a pattern. When one civilization collapses, and then another future civilization emerges to take its place, the emergence of the other civilization, the second civilization, tends to center around an area which was located on the periphery of the first civilization. And the reason why, and there are examples of this, I mean, Minoan Crete was on the periphery of the Aegean archipelago, which then turned into the center of classical civilization. France was on the periphery of the Roman Empire when the Roman Empire and classical civilization collapsed, but it became the first center of Western civilization when Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800, etc., etc. One can give many more examples of this. I won't bother going through the whole list. But there is this pattern where one civilization collapses and another emerges to take its place, and the center of the second emerging civilization is located on the periphery of the previous collapsed civilization. The reason why that happens is that the peripheral areas of the first civilization are located far enough from that civilization's center to be insulated from the bad ideas, the irrationality, the stupidity, and the various social pathologies that have instigated and created the decline and collapse of the old civilization. But it is not so far away as to be totally immune to the influence that might be exerted by the remaining good ideas that come from that civilization. So it's in this sweet spot. And if you look at the American empire and its extent, who is on the periphery of it? Sort of in, sort of out. It's Ukraine. It's a place like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Poland. Western civilization has endured many crises in its history, and it has shown a remarkable ability to overcome these crises. This is why the center of Western civilization throughout its history has shifted from one place to another. First it was France, for a while it became London. It shifted among various European capitals. During the Spanish Empire, it was arguably in Madrid, and so forth and so on. And now in its current incarnation, it's in Washington, D.C. But the West is in trouble. There's a crisis of Western civilization, and everyone knows what it is, to quote Jonathan Bowden. So the question we face now is, will the West be able to reinvent itself and reemerge reinvigorated, reinvented in new form somewhere else, or will it collapse? If it collapses, there are really no alternatives to it. Russia does not offer any civilizational concept worthy of adherence. It is a violent, brutal, mendacious, thuggish kind of society that really doesn't offer anything to the world. At least not unless it were to radically change. And there's no indication that it will radically change. Russia has been weakened so severely that the best case scenario for it going forward is that it will basically turn into an oil company owned by China. And China also doesn't offer anything, because Chinese civilization is just 5,000 years of despotism after despotism after despotism, which established itself and then collapsed in paranoia after its rulers lost the mandate of heaven. And of course, India is India. I don't think I have to say much about that. Although I'll leave a link in a pinned comment or somewhere to a very interesting talk about the nature of Indian society that I think everyone should watch. And the person giving the talk points out some very disturbing things about just how India works, especially the fact that in India it is widely considered to be effeminate to do your job diligently and effectively. Now, with a set of social values like that, Indian society is not going to be able to achieve anything significant, no matter how large India's population is. So none of these other civilizations offer any kind of viable alternative. The West will either reinvent itself, or we will return to a dark age of unknown and unpredictable duration. But in order for the West to reinvent itself, it has to be under some sort of stress, some sort of stimulus that will promote innovation, that will promote a rethinking of the old ideas, that will promote radical experimentation. And the only place that's under sufficient pressure for that to be possible is Ukraine. This is why right-wingers should care about the war in Ukraine and should take the Ukrainian side in this ultimately, for all the problems that are going on with Zelensky. You don't have to tell me about the corruption of the Zelensky government. I know all about it. I probably know it better than you do, frankly. But this is a very quick explanation of it without me going into the details. I think that if Western civilization is to reinvent itself and reemerge, it will probably do so somewhere in a place like Ukraine. And if that doesn't happen, then the West is probably finished. So if you care about its continued survival, or if you care to have a civilization that emerges that is like the West, that is a sort of successor civilization to the West, even if it's not exactly the same as the West, in the sense that the West was the successor civilization to classical antiquity, to Greco-Roman antiquity. If you care about something like that, you should care about this war. But as I said, Trump is making world historic blunders, and this may end up stimulating Europe to pay for its own defense, and that stimulus may cause things to happen that we as yet cannot predict. But there is a world in which this turns out for the best. It's not clear that we're in that timeline, but it is a possibility. But anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. I want to stop talking about that subject and just end this, perorate this by saying, look, the multiracial state is a failure. The left is insane. They are at war with you. They consider themselves to be at war with you. When you gather in large numbers and you kill people over political differences, that's called a war. Okay? Ukraine and Russia are at war. Russia thinks that it has a right to an empire and the right to control Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine doesn't think that. Ukraine wants to be a sovereign nation. Ukrainians and Russians disagree about politics, and they're killing each other over their political disagreements. That's called a war. Okay? So the left sees itself as being at war with the right. Understand that. Understand who they are. Understand who these vile, blood-curdling mutants are and react accordingly. Gather together with like-minded people. Arm yourselves, prepare, form communities, form support networks. Get ready, because it's not going to get better. And if it is going to get better eventually, it'll get a whole hell of a lot worse first. Know that, understand that, and yeah. Rest in peace, both to Iryna Zarutska and to Charlie Kirk.